Hello and welcome to this Disability Training Resource Pack. My name is Kt Tupling and I am the Disability Advisor for Oxford Diocese. I'm an ambulant wheelchair user, which means that I use crutches most of the time, but sometimes when I need a bit more speed, I get my wheelchair out. My paid role involves advising the Oxford Diocese on disability awareness and inclusion, a diocese that covers the counties of Oxfordshire, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. In a nutshell, my role is to provide support, experience and expertise in policies and practices of inclusion of those with disabilities across the spectrum of disability and marginalisation. What does it mean to be a disability advisor? Well, in a nutshell, here are some basic principles around my role. It's to recognise and impart to other people there is no distinct community of disabled people. We are all very disparate and have very broad experiences across the whole spectrum. Some of us are born with disabilities, others become disabled through accident or incident. We all have very different stories. It's to be aware of the social and political attitudes in our history towards disability. The Poor Law Act of 1388, the Welfare Act of 1948, the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, and the Equality Act 2010, all of which underpin how we should approach disability in society and in businesses, clubs and organisations such as the Church of England. It's to help people appreciate there is an etiquette around disability, to explain some of the do's and don'ts of handling disabled people and our equipment. If I sit down, don't take my crutches away, they're my legs. But also around guide dogs, assistance dogs, who are protected under law. So you can't turn a guide dog away from your church building, and you certainly should not distract them when they are in duty, on duty, and doing their work. It's recognising minority stress and power imbalance. There's more to including us than simply providing a ramp or making sure the induction hearing loop is working in the building, if you have one. It's recognising who holds the power in these conversations and who doesn't. It is championing the gifts and the insights that we bring to the church. Disabled people are not a problem to be solved. We are a much part of the body of Christ as the able-bodied, fit and healthy people alongside us. Is to offer disability awareness training to everybody, really, diocesan staff, churches and individuals. You need training? Here I am. I can help with that. And within that, teaching a good theology of personhood, being made in God's image, even if that doesn't quite look like what you expect. Teaching around the careful use of language in liturgy and better practice in prayer ministry. And supporting people, disabled people, already in ministry and leadership roles, discerning vocations amongst disabled people, advocating for disabled people who are struggling or may not have come out about being disabled. So in this video, we're going to be having a brief look at disability and UK politics. Political Britain. We'll begin in 1388 with the Statute of Cambridge, also known as the Poor Law Act. It distinguished for the first time between those who are the deserving poor, the disabled and older people, who may claim alms, and the undeserving poor, who may not. In the 1530s, the dissolution of the monasteries meant there was no further support for disabled people, and the Poor Law Act created taxation to try and address this. You can imagine it did not go down very well. In 1547, the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, Bedlam Hospital, was given over to house mental patients, the first formal institution which lasted until the 1960s. The phrase mental patients had a very broad spectrum. In 1601, the Elizabethan Poor Law expanded the definition of the deserving poor to include children, introduced the state administration of disabled people. Disability is the individual's problem, but the state's role is to manage them en masse. And in 1714, the Vagrancy Act first used the word lunatics legally, meaning people experiencing mental health distress, and they could now be forcibly detained. The 1750s onwards saw the Industrial Revolution, which was huge, but also disabled many generations. There are reports of limbs being lost to machines. People who are deemed to be late or lazy were made to drag millstones up and down the shop floor, the factory floor, as an example to others, and sustained injuries in the process. So the introduction of machines was not necessarily a good thing for human health and fitness. Moving forward, 1816 through to about 1914 saw the opening of 100+ mental institutions across the country, with a roundabout conservative estimate of 100,000 people living in them, most forcibly detained, and with a very broad understanding of what mental health might look like. These only began to close from 1970s onwards. The first pressure group formed to defend the liberty of people in such asylums was formed in 1845. And in the mid to late 1800s, this saw the beginning really of modern charitable organizations established by philanthropists, parents and carers for, not by, disabled people and those suffering from mental health issues. Queen Victoria gave permission for the very first deaf schools around this time. In 1868, the Royal National Institute for the Blind was formed, the RNIB. In 1890, the British Deaf Association is founded. Just a word on this to be very cautious. This was more about segregation and assimilation than it was about celebrating the gifts that deaf people had. A great Ordist tradition of trying to ensure that deaf children were made to speak and to listen, even when they physically could not. In 1899, the National League of the Blind and Disabled is established as a trade union. And in 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act required school boards to identify children who were defective and send them to live in institutions. This is just to give you a brief context for this country. World War I, the Great War, created, conservative estimate, 20 million disabled men across Europe. The 1920s sees more unions of disabled war veterans formed, blind workers march on London against poor pay and conditions, and the Blind Persons Act is passed, introduced and supported by disabled people. I have a theory that the war made people suddenly very squeamish about dispatching people into institutions, when these were then people who are coming back from the war as broken heroes. You couldn't dispatch a war hero to an institution. You want to keep them at home. And therefore, how do you cope in that household without support? In between the wars, 1933 to 1939, German authorities forcibly sterilized, conservative estimate, 360,000 disabled Germans. And in World War II, conservative estimate, between 75,000 and 250,000 people with intellectual and physical impairments are systematically murdered under the Nazi Action T4 racial hygiene program. These are people who are disabled and intellectually impaired, to use the language of the time, alongside travelers, gypsies, the gay community, and Jews. In 1948, the National Health Service Act and the National Assistance Act were passed, the introduction of the welfare state and the official end of the language of the deserving poor. Yes, we've taken from 1388 to 1948 to be relabeled. Altogether, we are in this, the welfare state, each of us recognizing at some point we will need the welfare to help us, the state to help us. So it's a great leveler in theory. No longer are we the deserving poor as a group, but everybody is recipient of the welfare state. The charitable approach to people with disabilities is no longer the official line, although the charitable philosophy continues. In 1969, the independent living movement begins in Berkeley, California, with the Disabled Students Program on the campus. And for the first time, a clarion call is heard: nothing about us without us. Back here in London, in 1972, Alf Morris, MP, was appointed as Britain's first Minister for Disabled People. In the same year, Paul Hunter, writing in The Guardian, lit a blue touch paper in the fight against discrimination when he wrote that people who are disabled should have equality with those who are not disabled. In 1995, the government introduces legislation to ban discrimination against disabled people. The DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, is limited in scope, and the duty to treat people equally is subject to reasonableness caveat. Easier to do than to say. Reasonable adjustments. Question is, who decides what's reasonable? The definition of disability in law is based on a medical model. Diagnosis means we must treat the person only, with no wider social implications. It doesn't really have any teeth. In 2005, the DDA Amendment Act extends anti-discrimination protection to land transport, small employers, and private clubs. Extends the definition of disability and introduces a public duty to promote disabled people's equality and involve disabled people. It's all about wanting to do more without any teeth if people don't. The Prime Minister's Strategy Unit publishes its report, Improving the Life Chances of Disabled People, setting out recommendations for achieving disabled people's equality by 2025. At the time of recording, they should have achieved it by next year. And in 2010, the UK government ratifies the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and passes the Single Equality Act. Much has yet to happen to make these rights a daily reality for the nearly 14.1 million disabled children and adults in the UK. If you read the 2010 Equalities Act, disability is little more than a footnote in a broader spectrum of protected characteristics that now come under the Equality Act. The law. So you are disabled under the Equality Act 2010 if you have a physical or mental impairment, tricky word, impairment, that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. In law, what does that mean? Substantial, more than minor or trivial. So it takes much longer than it usually would to complete a daily task like getting dressed or having a shower. Long term means 12 months or more. So a breathing condition that develops as a result of a lung infection. Cerebral palsy, in my case, born with, neurological, and not going to get better. A progressive condition is one that gets worse over time. So people with progressive conditions can be classed as disabled. You automatically meet the disability definition under the Equality Act 2010 from the day you're diagnosed with HIV infection, cancer, or multiple sclerosis, an immediate buy-in. The Church of England is not exempt from the Equalities Act 2010, contrary to popular belief. There are a couple of small caveats over whether a church can employ a woman as its incumbent and alternative provision for women bishops, but that's it. A lack of accessibility has not yet been brought to court. Not yet. Disability and society in the UK. How many of us are there, according to the official recorded figures, the Office of National Statistics and the Charity Scope? In 2020, there were 14.1 million disabled people in the UK. Nationally, that's 20% of the population are recognised as disabled or known to be. I'm sure there are a whole heap more out there, which means 8% of children, 19% of working age adults. We are everywhere, in every age group, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and class. We are more likely than our non-disabled peers to experience poverty. We're twice as likely to be unemployed as our non-disabled peers. And we face, on average, an extra £800 a month in costs compared to our non-disabled peers. These are things like we can't afford to get cold, so the heating needs to go on. We often can't afford public transport, so we have to get taxis and things because public transport, and I mean afford in terms of our physicality, public transport doesn't allow us to get on there with wheelchairs or guide dogs or power chairs. And so we go to the extra expense of cars or hire cars or taxis. All of these cost a lot more. Adaptations to homes, different kinds of ways of eating and food needs, medication and equipment that we can't get on the NHS quickly. Again, by scope, 32% of disabled people felt negatively judged by non-disabled people. The tuts, as a wheelchair user tries to move around a restaurant. Guide dogs turned away from restaurants or taxis or church buildings on the grounds of, I don't do pets. Guide dogs are protected under the Equalities Act. You can't do that. And during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, we made 6 out of 10 deaths, disabled people. We didn't die from our medical conditions, we died from coronavirus. But 6 out of 10 of those deaths were people who were already disabled. Different models of defining disability and describing the experience. The oldest one really is the medical model. This says we need to fix the person who is ill through medication, through manipulation or surgery, and a compassionate society will invest resources in healthcare and services in an attempt to cure disabilities, to improve functionality, to allow disabled people a more normal life. Who defines normal? The social model really first finds its feet in the 1960s in those campaigns in California and then across the country and then across the world. Says, no, it's not about the individual's medical diagnosis. It's about society. Society disables us. My wheelchair is brilliant if it meets a set of steps. Absolutely hopeless. So remove the steps rather than fix the legs. So we need to have intervention to remove systemic barriers, negative attitudes, and exclusion by society. That's the main contributing factor in disabling individuals, not taking account of and including people regardless of difference. The individual model, I call It Sucks to Be You. And it basically says the individual needs to try and work out what's best for them, to fix themselves or change things around them. And it's really sad that you're disabled. I'm so sorry, but it's really down to you. There, but by the grace of God go I. Another of my favourites is the charity model. This doesn't say it sucks to be you, but do your best. This says, oh, poor you. We must try and intervene to make your life a little bit happier because you are a victim, you are weak and you are broken, and you need us to provide for you because you are incapable of doing so. And finally, the eugenics model. In a nutshell, the weak, the sick, the ill, the elderly, the disabled are a financial drain and regrettably dispensable for the greater good. You may think that doesn't really exist, but on the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you some quotes and examples of where that's still very much alive and well in modern society. If you need to skip through those slides, then please do. Let's begin with Martin Luther, the great theologian of the Reformation. On observing a 12-year-old boy who could, in Luther's phrase, only eat and excrete, he wrote, I simply think he is a mass of flesh without a soul. Couldn't the devil have done this? And recommends that the parents suffocate their child. This is an attitude I have seen many times, and many disabled people will tell you, we come across this a lot. It's better you weren't here. You're a drain on society. Joseph Fletcher in 1968, he said, parents have no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it's put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from offence against a person, and a Downs is not a person. And Richard Dawkins in 2014, his advice to a woman pondering the possibility of being pregnant with a child diagnosed as Down syndrome was, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. Challenge in 2021, he clarified that position. It seems to me to be plausible that you probably would increase the amount of happiness in the world more by having another child instead of one with a disability. Peter Singer, in an interview in 2017 around personhood and intelligence of learning disabled people, said this: most people think that the life of a dog or a pig is of less value than the life of a normal human being. On what basis, then, could they hold that the life of a profoundly intellectual, disabled human being with intellectual capacities inferior to those of a dog or a pig is of equal value to the life of a normal human being? His sliding scale is animals before people with learning disabilities. And Iceland in 2017 reported it had almost eradicated Down syndrome births. We look at it, the termination of a fetus diagnosed as having Down syndrome, as a thing that we ended. We ended a possible life that may have had a huge complication, preventing suffering for the child and for the family. Somebody once wrote, first they came for those with Down syndrome, then they came for the gene of autism. When will they come for me? So let's pause and reflect. And when the final screen comes up, you may wish to pause the video and think about these questions. With which of these models or attitudes were you already familiar, and which are new to you? Where do you see these models and attitudes in society, in politics, in shopping centres and GP surgeries, in entertainment, in education, in social clubs, in the gym? Do you see these models or attitudes within church teaching and practice? And what is your experience of disability or chronic illness? Pause the video, have a think about these questions, and then move on to some potential resources that might be useful to you. So here we have some resources that you might find useful, things on the web, and also books that you can purchase and have a look at in your own time. A variety of websites. You can find more about the models of disability and the types and definitions. There are a lot. I just honed them down to the 5 you saw on screen. historicengland.org.uk gives you the highlights of the emergence of a disabled people's movement in the UK. Inclusive Online Church Consultation. What did we find out about inclusive online, on-site and hybrid church during particularly the height of the pandemic? The Church of England's Buildings Council, looking at access to church buildings, a very useful document there. And the Heart Edge series, a broad series about inclusion across the whole spectrum, particularly the series called Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up, looking at ableism, faith and church. And then some books that I would recommend. At the Gates, co-authored by Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and Emily Richardson. My Body is Not a Prayer Request, written by Amy Kenny. Crippled Grace, Disability, Virtue Ethics, and the Good Life by Shane Clifton. And Loving Our Own Bones by Julia Watts-Belser. And finally, a few that I may have had a hand in. 2 Grove booklets and something else. So Grove booklet, Worship and Disability, co-written with Anna Delange. Pilgrims in the Dark, a story of disability and engagement with church, written by Disability and Jesus. And my latest Grove booklet, Being Disabled, Being Human, part of the Ethics series. And if you want to get hold of me, my contact details are on the screen. Thank you for watching.